The cold had a sound. At first, it was the chattering of her son's teeth, a frantic rhythm of fear against the howling wind. Then it was the sound of her own heart, a desperate drum beating against her ribs. But the most terrifying sound was the one that came last, the silence. The silence that fell when her daughter, Lily, became too weak to shiver, her small body finally surrendering to the frost that had crept into their metal tomb. Emily Harris was praying for a miracle, her whispers lost in the roar of the blizzard that had swallowed them whole. She'd been praying for hours, stranded in a frozen car, buried on a forgotten stretch of highway. But the blizzard only answered with more rage, piling snow higher and higher against the windows, sealing them in. Hope was a dying ember, and Emily was watching it fade. She held Lily's chillingly still form, desperately trying to breathe warmth back into her, when a new sound cut through the storm. It wasn't the wind. It was sharper, deliberate, a tapping on the glass. Emily's head snapped up. Through the swirl of snow plastering the driver's side window, a shape materialized. A dark figure, huge and indistinct, a ghost in the whiteout. Her breath caught in her throat. Who could possibly be out here? The figure leaned closer, and a hand, dark against the snow, wiped a small circle clear on the glass. A face appeared, a man's face, etched with urgency, his voice a muffled but powerful rumble that vibrated through the car. "Open this door right now." Emily stared, paralyzed. Her mind, slow and clouded by the cold, struggled to process it. Then his face pressed closer, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that pierced through her terror. "Come with me," he said. The words clear this time, a lifeline thrown into an abyss. To stay meant certain death. The cold had already begun its final work on her daughter. To go with him, a complete stranger who had emerged from the heart of the blizzard, what did that mean? Every instinct screamed danger, yet she knew the greater danger was staying put. Her choice wasn't between safety and danger. It was between a certain end and a terrifying, unknown beginning. We tell stories about the moments that change everything, the crossroads where a single choice can mean the difference between life and death. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a single one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Just 6 hours earlier, the storm was only a whisper, a footnote in a weather report that promised nothing more than a light dusting. For Emily Harris and her 2 children, 7-year-old Ben and 5-year-old Lily, the day had begun with the cheerful hum of holiday excitement. They were on their way to see their grandparents, their old SUV packed with presents and the happy energy of 2 kids ready for Christmas. Ben, the serious older brother, sat in the back with a book, though his eyes kept flicking to the window. Lily, a bundle of energy, was singing off-key Christmas carols. Emily smiled, glancing at them in the rearview mirror. This was what she loved about the holidays, the journey, the cocoon of their little family moving through the world together. The first flakes began to fall around noon, delicate and hesitant. "Snow!" Lily squealed, pressing her face to the glass. Emily had felt a small thrill. A white Christmas was always more magical. The forecast had only mentioned flurries. They had plenty of gas, warm coats, and a thermos of hot cocoa. They were prepared for a little winter weather. They were not prepared for this. The whispers grew into a roar. The delicate flakes thickened into a dense, blinding curtain. The sky didn't just darken, it collapsed. Within 30 minutes, the road ahead and behind had vanished. Emily's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. Her focus narrowed to the few feet of asphalt she could still see. Other cars were long gone. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. Then it happened. A cough from the engine, a violent shudder that shook the car. The dashboard lights flickered like a dying heartbeat. Emily pressed the gas, a prayer on her lips, but the engine only sputtered again. A plume of acrid smoke billowed from under the hood and was ripped away by the wind. Then, silence. The car coasted for another 100 feet and came to a dead stop. Emily turned the key again and again. Nothing. The battery was dead. They were stranded. She pulled out her phone, her fingers already stiff with cold. No signal. Of course. They were on a remote mountain pass, miles from the nearest town. It felt like they'd driven off the edge of the world. The blizzard, sensing their vulnerability, intensified its assault. The wind howled, rocking the SUV. Snow began to pile up with terrifying speed, driven sideways, plastering itself against the windows. Emily watched in horror as a drift formed around the tires, cementing them to the frozen ground. They were being buried alive. An hour passed, then 2. Inside the car, the world had shrunk to a small, dark, and rapidly cooling space. At first, Emily tried to be brave. "It's okay, you guys," she said, her voice bright and brittle. "Just a little car trouble. Someone will be along in a minute. Let's sing a song." They sang every Christmas carol they knew, their voices growing weaker as the cold seeped into their bones. They played I Spy, but soon there was nothing to spy but the swirling white. The game ended when Ben looked at her, his face pale with fear, and asked, "Mom, why isn't anyone coming?" Emily didn't have an answer. The cheerful facade crumbled. The interior of the car was now as cold as the world outside. Frost bloomed on the inside of the windows, intricate, cruel flowers of ice. She gathered the children into her arms in the back seat, wrapping them in every spare coat and blanket she could find. Their shared body heat was a pathetic defense against the plunging temperature. "We have to stay awake," she told them, her voice low and urgent. "Tell me a story, Ben. Tell me about your new video game. Lily, sweetheart, what are you going to ask Santa for?" But Lily's teeth were chattering too hard for her to speak. Ben tried to be brave, but his words were slurred as his own body began to betray him. The cold was a thief, stealing their words, their energy, their warmth. A deep terror settled in Emily's chest. This was the ultimate parental nightmare, the absolute crushing inability to protect your children. She had underestimated the storm. She was their mother, their protector, and she was failing. 4 hours in, the daylight was gone. The car, once a shelter, now felt like a coffin. The snow had piled past the windows, sealing them in a tomb of white. That's when Lily stopped shivering. For a moment, Emily felt a flash of relief, but then she looked down. Her face was chalky white, her lips tinged with blue. Her body, which had been trembling violently, was now terrifyingly still. Her breaths were shallow, almost imperceptible. Emily knew what this meant. She'd read about hypothermia. The shivering stops when the body gives up its fight to stay warm. It was the final stage. "No," she whispered, the word a ragged puff of vapor. "No, no, no." Raw panic seized her. She started rubbing Lily's arms and legs. "Lily, baby, wake up! You have to wake up! Stay with me!" Her voice was a desperate plea against the storm. Ben started to cry, not loud, but with the quiet, hopeless sobs of a child who knows something is terribly wrong. Emily held her daughter, tears freezing on her cheeks, feeling the precious, irreplaceable warmth slipping away. She was losing the battle. It was in that moment of ultimate despair that the knock came, sharp, insistent, impossible. The knock on the glass wasn't just a sound, it was a break in reality. Emily stared at the dark shape outside, her mind a whirlwind of terrors. A man appearing from the depths of a killer blizzard, miles from anywhere? It was the beginning of a horror story. But then she looked down at Lily's pale, still face. She looked at Ben, his eyes wide with fear, and a tiny flicker of hope. The horror story was already here. It was inside the car with them. The stranger was an unknown. "There is no time." The man's voice boomed again. "If you stay here, you and your children will not survive this night." He knew. He could see their fate as clearly as she could. He wasn't asking. He was ordering her to live. The war inside Emily lasted only a second. To trust him was a gamble. To stay was a certain death. She looked at Lily, limp and fragile in her arms. She had to take the gamble. With a trembling hand, she fumbled with the frozen lock and pushed the handle. The door was ripped from her grasp by the wind, and the blizzard screamed into the car. Emily recoiled, shielding the children. The man was there, a giant silhouette against the swirling white. He was a black man, tall and broad-shouldered, but his eyes were clear, and in them Emily saw not malice, but intense, focused will. He leaned in, his gaze immediately falling on Lily. "Give her to me," he commanded. Hesitation flickered in Emily's eyes. He saw it. "I'm a trained search and rescue volunteer," he said, his voice softening slightly but losing none of its authority. "I know what I'm doing. We need to move. Now." The words search and rescue were a key unlocking the last of her resistance. It made sense. Who else would be out in this? This wasn't a monster. This was a rescuer. This was their miracle. Nodding, Emily carefully transferred Lily's fragile body into his waiting arms. The man, who she would later know as David Turner, took her gently. He immediately unzipped his own thick coat, wrapped the child against his chest to share his body heat, and zipped the coat back up around her. "My son," Emily said, her voice cracking. "You take the boy," David instructed, already turning back into the storm. He pointed a gloved finger toward a large backpack he had dropped in the snow. "Hold on to my pack. Do not let go. And whatever you do, keep up." Exiting the car was like stepping into a roaring, frozen ocean. The snow was waist-high and thick as wet cement. The wind hit Emily with the force of a solid wall, stealing the air from her lungs. "This way," David's voice cut through the gale. He was only a few feet ahead, but he was already just a dark shape in the maelstrom. Emily grabbed Ben's hand, slung her other arm through the strap of David's pack, and began to move. It was less like walking and more like wading through Arctic sludge. Every step was a monumental effort. 2 miles, he had said. It sounded as impossible as a journey to the moon. The trek was a brutal sensory assault. The wind was a constant, deafening roar. The cold had sharp teeth that bit at any exposed skin. The world had no up or down, only the blinding snow and the shape of the man in front of her. David moved with a steady, powerful rhythm, breaking a path through the deep drifts. He carried Lily's weight without any sign of fatigue. He was their human snowplow, their only beacon. He didn't speak much, just short commands. "Stay close. Watch your footing here. Keep moving." Emily's body screamed in protest. Her lungs burned. Her legs turned to lead. She fell again and again. Every time, the thought of just lying there and letting the cold take her was a sweet, seductive whisper. But then she would see David, still moving forward with her daughter held against his chest. She would feel Ben's small, cold hand in hers, and she would get up. In a moment that would forever be seared in her memory, her foot caught on a hidden root. She pitched forward, and her grip on Ben slipped. He let out a cry as he tumbled into a deep drift. Panic flared, white-hot and blinding. Before she could even scream, David had reached back with one long arm, hauling her upright with an almost inhuman strength. Then he reached down and scooped Ben up from the snow as if he weighed nothing. "Hold on tighter," he said, his voice firm but not angry. "We're almost there." That single act shattered her last doubts. He was her protector. His quiet, determined competence was more reassuring than 1,000 words of comfort. They plodded on. Time ceased to have meaning. Then David stopped and raised a gloved hand. "There," he said. Emily squinted. Through the veil of snow, she saw it. A light. A tiny, flickering pinprick of orange in an endless universe of white. It was a window. It was a home. It was hope, made visible. That tiny light ignited a fire in her frozen core. With renewed energy, she tightened her grip on Ben's hand and pushed forward, her eyes fixed on the finish line of the most grueling race of her life. They stumbled up a small incline, and suddenly, the cabin was right there. David hit the door with his shoulder, and they half fell into the room beyond. The change was instantaneous. First, the sound. The roar of the blizzard was gone, replaced by the crackling of a fire in a large stone fireplace. Then the warmth. It washed over them, a living thing that chased away the deadly chill. And finally, the smell. Wood smoke and brewing coffee. The smell of sanctuary. They were inside. They were safe. The battle was over. The dam inside Emily broke. Her legs gave out and she sank to the floor, pulling Ben into her lap as deep, ragged sobs shook her body. Tears of relief so profound it was painful. David didn't stop. He crossed to the hearth and gently laid Lily on a thick rug in front of the fire. He swiftly unwrapped her from his coat. Her skin was a frightening, waxy white. He checked her pulse and breathing, then began rubbing her limbs, working to restore circulation. He called out instructions to Emily, pulling her from her own emotional collapse. Get the boy's wet clothes off him. There are blankets in that chest. There's broth on the stove. Get him to drink some. His commands gave her purpose. She moved stiffly, stripping Ben of his wet jacket and boots and wrapping him in a thick wool blanket. She helped him sip the warm, salty broth, and with every sip, she saw a little more life returning to his pale face. Her attention snapped back to Lily. David had her wrapped in several blankets now. And then, a sound. A small, weak whimper. Lily stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open. A faint but definite pink was starting to return to her cheeks. "Mama," Lily whispered, her voice a tiny thread of sound. "I'm here, baby," Emily choked out, fresh tears streaming down her face. "I'm here." An hour later, the crisis had passed. Both the children, warm and fed, were fast asleep on the rug. David finally sat down in a worn armchair, handing her a steaming mug of coffee. For a long time, they sat in silence, watching the flames. "You saved us," Emily said, finally, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "How can I ever thank you?" David stared into the fire. The firelight revealed a deep sadness in his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy with grief. "Years ago, on a night just like this, my wife, Sarah, her car broke down on this same stretch of road." Emily froze, the mug halfway to her lips. "I was part of the county search and rescue team," he continued, his voice thick with memory. "We got the call, but the conditions, they were impossible. We couldn't get the vehicles through. We tried on foot, but we couldn't find her." He paused, and in the silence, Emily could hear the echo of a heart breaking. "We found her the next morning," he said quietly. "I was the one who found her." He finally looked at Emily, his eyes a raw, open wound. "I'm a rescuer, and I couldn't save my own wife." He looked over at the sleeping forms of Lily and Ben. "After that, I left the team. I bought this cabin, but I made a promise that I would never, ever let it happen to anyone else. Not on my watch. Every time a storm like this rolls in, I walk that highway, just in case." The pieces clicked into place for Emily. He wasn't just a kind stranger. He was a guardian. He had turned his greatest pain into a shield for others. He had saved her and her children, not just out of kindness, but out of a deep, abiding, and painful love for the woman he had lost. The morning broke in absolute silence. The wind had died, and the world was transformed under a pristine blanket of white, glittering in the brilliant sun. Inside, the atmosphere was one of a strange, temporary family. Ben and Lily, though still weak, were sitting up by the fire, playing with a set of hand-carved wooden animals David had given them. Their laughter was the most beautiful sound Emily had ever heard. David made them all pancakes. The smell of normalcy and life felt like a miracle. After they ate, he used a satellite phone to call the county sheriff, calmly reporting their situation and coordinates. A few hours later, the sound of snowmobiles broke the silence. It was time to leave. As Emily bundled her children up, she tried once more to find the words. "I owe you everything," she said, her voice thick. "My life, their lives." David simply stood in the doorway of his cabin. He looked at her, then at the children, and a small, sad, but genuine smile touched his lips. He had kept his promise. That was all the thanks he needed. He simply nodded. The news of the incredible rescue spread, becoming a local legend. But Emily made sure it was more than that. She made sure everyone knew his name, David Turner. The town insisted on honoring him, presenting him with a medal for civilian bravery. At the ceremony, Emily spoke of a man who had faced the greatest loss imaginable and chosen not bitterness, but a fierce, protective love for strangers. A quiet hero who turned his unending grief into an act of grace. That medal was just a piece of metal. The real change happened in the months that followed. Emily and her children didn't forget the man in the woods. They began visiting him on sunny weekends, bringing groceries, books, and the beautiful noise of children's laughter. Slowly, the quiet man who had hidden from the world started to reconnect with it. The laughter of the children he had saved began to fill the empty spaces in his life. They became his found family, his solitary vigil transformed into a bond of life and gratitude. Sometimes the worst storms don't just bring danger, they send the right person at the right time. They reveal the quiet heroes who walk among us. David Turner was one such hero, an angel in a winter coat. He stepped into a blizzard to save a stranger's family, and in doing so, he found a way to honor the wife he couldn't save, turning a story of tragic loss into a legacy of life. In the heart of a deadly storm, one family was saved not by a fire or a roof, but by the warmth of a broken heart that refused to let anyone else be lost to the cold. It's a reminder that the deepest wounds can often fuel the greatest compassion. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more tales of courage and humanity. And tell us in the comments, what does a hero look like to you?